What? So, Alba Skylark again. If you wanted to study cognitive psychology, what would be a good book to start with? And I guess it depends on what you mean by to study.
Yeah. So I actually grabbed this, so I wouldn't be pulling it out from behind me. So I know this author gets a fair amount of hate recently for some of the books he's published, but I stand by his older work certainly, and I'm going to read his newer stuff and see like what the drama is, because I honestly don't know. So, Steven Pinker, How the Mind Works. This, I think, is a reasonable entry point into something like cognitive psychology. Again, it's Steven Pinker, How the Mind Works. It is not a new book by any stretch of the imagination. Try and look at published. Back says 99. I can't believe it's that old. Oh, yeah, it's that old. So, old entry point, but a good entry point because I think it tackles a lot of the foundational assumptions and ways that cognitive psychologists try to tackle problems. So I think it's a good entry point. It's doing something that Peterson can't quite manage doing in 12 Rules, where it's written for a general audience but incorporates research and isn't afraid to talk about the experiments and things in a way that trusts the reader to be able to understand. And I mean, it definitely made sense to me because it's my field. But I think for somebody who's not familiar with cognitive psychology, I think it's still a reasonable entry point. And trying to think of a different thing to say that wouldn't just be repeating myself. Because that's what I would do in lectures, repeat myself in a different way so people have time to write. Yeah. So it's basically how your mind works. And something that I'll talk about a little bit in the psychiatry video that's coming next week is sort of the differences between the different sort of boxes of psychology. And in cognitive psychology especially, we're interested in the stuff that's going on in the cognitive black box. So this behaviorism, US behaviorism didn't really take off elsewhere. It made it to Canada, but didn't really import well into Europe and things. So behaviorists were studying animal models, looking at stimulus response. Animal pushes a lever, gets a thing out. This is what we're interested in. And they tried to scale it up for human behavior with some success. One of the big guys, Watson, actually went into advertising and was one of the first sort of madmen almost with, we set up this stimulus and we get the response of people buying our stuff. So on some level, it does work, but the cognitive revolution, and at some point I will make a video on that because it's sexy and it's where cognitive came from. Part of it was just behaviorism can't account for a lot of things going on. And what's going on inside this black box between the stimulus and the response is important. And we should try to figure out what processes are happening in there. And just because we can't directly measure them with like a ruler or something, it doesn't mean that we can't measure them. And so a lot of cognitive psychology is built up on this assumption or assumptions of basically like certain mental processes take a certain amount of time. And so if something is taking more time, that means it might be harder. They're having to go further in their neural representations of things, tons of different assumptions that I think are reasonable assumptions for how the cognition works. So yeah, I think that was an answer.
It was certainly a book recommendation.
It was definitely a book recommendation.